Today I shall tell you a story passed down through the centuries, the story of the Three Kingdoms. Long ago, near the end of the Han Dynasty in ancient China, the once mighty empire had divided into three formidable states: the Wei, the Shu, and the Wu. These three titans can easily be compared to the evolving state of the video game industry. A combination of three systems always coexists in a delicate balance, competing to deliver the best experiences exclusive to their own. Others have come and gone, and rarely does a fourth come to rival the juggernauts. Yet, how can these two very different topics be intertwined?
While video games based on traditional China aren't impossible to find, they certainly don't come up a lot in the industry. Why is that? Well, video games in China have been in a weird place since the inception of the medium.
China never really experienced video games like the rest of the world did. During the birth of arcades and consoles in the late 70s, the country was going through its own complex political reforms. Access to media in general was something that needed to be improved upon, and it seemed like a better idea to get basic television access to citizens before games. Eventually, games would come to China, but at a steep price, a 130% tariff on all games and systems. Official manufacturers were nervous to pay such a fee if they weren't successful, so the majority of games that did exist were knockoffs sold in the gray market. Many of this technology was pirated, and a negative stigma of gaming formed within the country. This led to a strict 15-year ban of games in China, starting in the year 2000. While the ban was eventually lifted, the government is still strictly controlling screen time.
Chinese developers haven't had a lot of time to craft their own games based on their rich history. Notably, Japan has tried to fill in the gaps. One such company is Koei, responsible for Romance of the Three Kingdoms, an early computer game based on ancient Chinese history. It was released for many home consoles and was based off the book of the same name. So, how well did they do? Well, today, that's what we're here to find out. So without further ado, let's explore the world of Chinese games, and through this warped history, we'll discover a lost dynasty of sorts that'll show us the way.
Remember when Mario went to China? No? Well, it's understandable if you don't. He hasn't been there in over 30 years. By the late 80s, the video game industry had been brought back to its former glory after a nasty crash in 1983. Nintendo, and by extension Mario, were on top of the world. In 1990, a survey of American kids found that more people could recognize Super Mario than Mickey Mouse. In 1989, Nintendo released the first mainstream handheld, the Game Boy, with a little game called Super Mario Land released alongside it on launch day. These days, Super Mario Land is one of the black sheeps of the Mario series. It was the first Mario game developed with no involvement of his creator, Shigeru Miyamoto. But make no mistake, this game was pretty popular when it came out. So popular, the Ambassadors of Funk made a whole music video about the game.
Welcome and enter the center of my Super Mario adventure. My girl's trapped on the other side of town, so I'm moving in leaps and bounds. Folks around my way think it's strange, but there's a villain to blame. Even my mom, she thinks I'm crazy, but I got to rescue Daisy.
In Super Mario Land, Mario is transported to Sarasaland to rescue Princess Daisy from a spaceman named Tatanga. Sarasaland is divided up into 4 kingdoms or worlds with 3 levels each. The worlds are based on real-life locales such as ancient Egypt, Bermuda, and Easter Island. The last world of the game takes place in the Chai Kingdom, based on ancient China.
I've got my original Game Boy and a copy of the game right here. So without further ado, let's plug this baby in, turn on the power, make sure we got some batteries, fiddle around with the contrast dial, and let's see what we get. Nobody said the Game Boy screen was going to be easy to see. I mean, look at this thing. There's no backlight, not to mention it's the color of pea soup. But I have a solution. If you got yourself a Game Boy Advance SP, released about 15 years later, you can pop this baby in, turn on the power, and here we got the game with a backlight and enhanced color. So, for the video today, I'm going to be showing the game with the enhanced colors, just to make it easier on the eyes.
So at the end of World 3, Mario defeats the Kingdom boss, hoping to see Daisy, but alas, it was only a decoy. In between levels, you can play a bonus game to score some extra lives. You have to time your button press very carefully if you want to get the best results.
Now that the bonus game is done, Mario moves on to his first level of the Chai Kingdom. Huh? Well, we're off to a great start.
What you just heard is dubbed the Oriental Riff, a Western creation in music in order to make something sound like it came from the East to American listeners. Even though Nintendo is a Japanese company, it looks like the riff made its way into their offices. These few notes are used in dozens of games, but it has little to no connection with actual Chinese music or culture.
Actual Chinese music, if you can even call it Chinese, started around 2700 BCE. We know this from writings which happened much later in history, referring to the Shah Dynasty, where the Yellow Emperor mythically sent one of his people to go make an instrument made out of makeshift bamboo. Now, he cut holes into it, and it's a far cry from my modern instrument like the clarinet here. But hey, that's where we might have got pitches from.
Going back to the actual game, you can see Mario platforming through the most stereotypical Chinese setting you could ask for. We got bamboo, we got mountains, we got wispy clouds. We even got a familiar looking pattern repeated throughout the entirety of the first two levels. This is called a meander, and is typically considered a Greek design. When searching Google for Greek patterns, it's the first result. But this pattern appears a lot in Chinese art and architecture as well. It's very possible the Chinese had done it first, as a variation of this design was found on bronzes from the Shang Dynasty, considered to be the first dynasty that we have real good proof of, starting around 1600 BCE.
Mario has quite a lot of foes he'll be facing on his trek through the Tri Kingdom. One of them's actually based on a Chinese myth, so let's see what Mario's up against.
The enemy in question is named Pianpi. In the game, it resembles a hopping woman, but its official artwork is barely recognizable compared to the sprite. In the game, Pianpi hops around endlessly and chases Mario. He can stomp on their head and immobilize them for a second, but they're essentially unkillable unless you have an invincibility star, which makes Mario an unstoppable force for a few seconds. They seem to be based on Hijinks, a sort of Chinese depiction of a hopping vampire. Qin Shi Huang, later the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, deployed forces in a war that would later unify China under his supervision. The people who dared to face him traveled far and wide from their homes, many perishing on their way or dying in battle. It is legend that the families of the departed turned to priests who could bring the bodies back to life in an evil ritual, resembling a reanimated corpse. Because of rigor mortis, however, the newly awakened bodies were forced to hop back home, usually rejected by the families that requested they be brought back. The tale seemed to gain traction much later in Chinese history, first showing up in the Qing dynasty, the last traditional one. This legend of the Hijinks later inspired a whole genre of vampire movies in China.
Pretty creepy, huh? Luckily for us, Mario jumps past the Pianpi, makes it to the final level of the game.
The final level sees Mario take to the skies of the Chai Kingdom in his little-known plane, the Sky Pop. It can fire projectiles at opposing planes and bird enemies, which the manual refers to as chickens, a faction of warbirds sent by Tatanga. We'll give the developers some credit, though, as the missiles could be nodding to China's invention of gunpowder in the 9th century. I can also confirm that China did indeed have chickens, much more docile than these ones, I might add. After shooting some down, Mario makes it to the boss of the area, a mysterious cloud known as Biokintin, a shy monster who hides behind a cloud. After firing multiple missiles, Tatanga reveals himself to Mario in his spaceship. A few more missiles and that's it! Mario rescues Daisy and the game is over.
Super Mario Land is quite a short game, but I find it interesting how it introduced ancient Chinese locales into it. Sure, the Chai Kingdom is far from accurate, but hey, enemies like the Pianpi showed that Nintendo was trying at least a little bit, but it lacks really any depth, and its subject matter is pretty shallow.
Hey, you ever heard of Pokemon? It's only the highest grossing franchise in the entire world. In it, you play as a young trainer who battles, catches, and trains monsters named, well, Pokemon. Right now, there are almost 900 different species, but it didn't used to be that way.
That's right, back in the 90s there was only 151 of them. The series got its start on our humble little gray brick here, the Game Boy.
By 1997, the original Game Boy seemed to be on the way out. It had enjoyed a long 8 years on the market, and it was clear that Nintendo needed a successor to the equally successful handheld. That is, until Pokemon Red and Blue came out the following year. It was a massive success, and Pokemon became a worldwide phenomenon, Pokemania as many called it. It spawned a TV show, trading card game, and of course, many video games that are still being churned out by the original developers to this day.
Today, let's take a look at one Pokemon of interest, the fish Pokemon, Magikarp.
Magikarp has a pretty simple design. I mean, look at it. It's just a fish. It's also one of the worst Pokemon in the entire game. It learns no damaging moves until level 15, and the only move it has until then is Splash, a move that literally does nothing. Even the Pokédex, which is an encyclopedia providing a summary of all Pokemon, bashes the poor fish in every game. In the distant past, it was somewhat stronger than the horribly weak descendants that exist today. An underpowered, pathetic Pokemon. It may jump high on rare occasions, but never more than 7 feet. Magikarp is a pathetic excuse for a Pokemon that is only capable of flopping useless in battle, as it can only splash around. Scientists as a result, it is considered to be weak.
It is said to be the world's weakest Pokemon. In terms of both power, no one knows why it is made. It is the most weak and pathetic Pokemon in the world. Lakes, rivers, and shallow
they exist in such multitudes, you'll soon grow tired of seeing them.
Totally pathetic, unreliable, known throughout the world for being super weak. Maybe in ancient times it was really strong. That's what the rumors say, but they're probably wrong. But now it's so weak, the weakest in the land. So weak that it's sad, really, really sad. The weak Pokemon, that's you, Magikarp. But though you are the weakest, still you found my heart.
But what if I told you that Magikarp can evolve into one of the best Pokemon in the entire game? That's right, if you spend the time and grind Magikarp all the way up to level 20, he'll evolve into the awesome, the powerful, the atrocious Pokemon, Gyarados! Yeah! That's more like it. Gyarados is awesome. They're very powerful, they learn great moves, and they're a heck of a lot better than Magikarp. And, believe it or not, they're actually based on a Chinese myth.
The legend of the Dragon's Gate is a myth that goes all the way back to the first dynasty of China, the Xia. We know about the Xia through ancient texts of the Zhou dynasty. existing nearly 1,000 years after the Shah allegedly existed. It is fabled that Yu the Great, the first ruler of China, promised aspiring carp or koi fish that if they managed to swim upstream the Yellow River, up the waterfall, and jump over the Dragon's Gate, that they'd be turned into great flying dragons, similar to how Magikarp evolves into Gyarados. It's even more fitting, as Gyarados is classified as water flying type within the games.
I'm rather impressed that a Chinese myth actually found its way into the juggernaut that is Pokemon. The series celebrates 25 years this year, and Magikarp and Gyarados have been there since the beginning, challenging players to train up a pathetic carp into a great and mighty dragon. Whether you're playing the games, watching the TV show, looking at the anime, reading the manga, there's always Magikarp and Gyarados to follow. So with that, I say let's switch gears and let's look at a game inspired by real Chinese history.
While handhelds like the Game Boy were still providing solid 2D experiences in the late 90s, games on consoles, thanks to better tech, began leaping into the third dimension. It was an exciting time for gaming, and a newcomer, Sony, overtook the kings, Nintendo and Sega, in the 5th generation. The PlayStation used CD-ROMs, a necessity for larger, more complex 3D experiences. Nintendo lost many of their top third-party developers, who switched to the PlayStation after Nintendo's new console, the Nintendo 64, was still using cartridges. One developer who released games for the PlayStation was Koei, remember them? They had been making games primarily based on the Three Kingdoms period, with a long-running strategy series continuing to this day. Banking on their success, Koei decided to use the Three Kingdoms once again to break free from their strategy game roots. What resulted was Dynasty Warriors, a fighting game using motion-captured animation, stunning fans of Koei's usual works.
Now some of you may know Dynasty Warriors as an overly action-heavy hack-and-slash game. That didn't start until the second entry. Today, Dynasty Warriors is one of the most famous franchises based on ancient China. And we're up to 9 entries if you can believe it or not. But the first game is rather tame by comparison. So let's take a look.
Koei's depiction of the Three Kingdoms is all based on a single novel, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written by Luo Guanxiang, a playwright from the late Huan and early Ming dynasties. The book tends to glorify the actual historical figures. It is a story first and foremost, after all. I'd like to preface this game by saying that the instruction manual is surprisingly dense. It's got long bios of every fighter, as well as pronunciations, background information, and tons more. It even lists a source citation at the end. We'll be referring to it as we explore today.
I'll be playing my copy of the game on my trusty PlayStation 3 Slim today. Remember that all PlayStation 3s can play original PlayStation games, old games on newish hardware. I love it!
So the game starts out with an opening cutscene that's nothing short of hype. It really pumps you up. We've got a slew of options, with the majority of the gameplay in its one-player mode.
No fighting game is complete without its cast of characters, all based on Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So let's take a quick, maybe not so quick look at all the playable characters in the game.
Zhao Zhao, while not playable until you unlock him, is a very important figure in these games. He was the second to last Grand Chancellor of the Eastern Han Dynasty before it fell and later secured the northern part of China to lay the foundation for the Wei Kingdom, which is also known as the Zhao Wei. Many think of him as a great military strategist. He even engaged in poetry. In the novel and games, however, he is portrayed as a one-note, cruel warlord, and is one of the final characters you get to face in the one-player mode. Guan Yu was a military general hailing from Shu. He briefly served under Zhao Zhao and was admired by him, but eventually he left him for greater things. He was murdered by one of his military opponents, and through the centuries gained status as a god of war of sorts. The games tend to highlight his loyalty, honor, and justice-oriented demeanor as a warrior. Zhang Fei, also from Shu, treated Guan Yu as an older brother of sorts and fought alongside him in many battles during the late Eastern Han. He served as a general in the late Shu up until his death. The game portrays him as an untamed, crazy fighter who values brawn over all else. In the novel, he was described as an alcoholic, which isn't brought up at all in the games for obvious reasons, as well as having a booming voice. Zhou Yun is treated as the mascot of the game. He's front and center on the cover art and shows up first on the character select screen. The game paints the narrative that he's a balanced warrior. Both the manual and game mention that he rode on horseback through Zhao Zhao's troops to rescue his master's infant, being heralded as a hero. Historical info on this dude is limited, and a lot of the information we have on him is from the novel. He was a part of the Five Tiger Generals, a group that shows up a lot in novels of the period, but didn't actually exist as far as we know. Dian Wei was known for his incredible strength, not only in the games and novel, but in real history as well. He was one of Zhao Zhao's strongest generals and gained his attention, becoming one of his bodyguards. The novel exaggerates his strength to mammoth proportions, claiming that he could pick up dead bodies by their feet and swing them around as weapons. He came from Wei. Xiao Ho Dun has a rather gross story associated with him. You've been warned. He was the cousin of Zhao Zhao, and as such, he was held in quite high regard by him, being one of his very best. In real history, he tragically lost his left eye during a battle by an unruly arrow. In the games and novels, however, they take the eyeball to the next level. After being struck, he allegedly ripped the eyeball out of his socket and subsequently ate it, claiming he couldn't just throw it away. Xu Ju is my favorite character. I mean, just look at him! We'll see more of him later, don't worry. Like Dian Wei, he was one of Zhao Zhao's bodyguards starting out. He eventually became a general of Wei. While strong, his soldiers thought him to be rather dim-witted. The game agrees, stating he's known as the Slow Tiger. The novel tends to highlight his bravery more than anything. Liu Shun was a prolific Chinese writer. Oh wait, wrong person. This Liu Shun was born about 16,000 years earlier, coming from Wu. Slowly rising throughout the ranks over time, he eventually became a great general, and was even in the running to succeed Sun Xuan, founder of the Wu Kingdom, for a short time. In the game, he is doubted by the older, more experienced generals. Tai Shi Zhe, also from Wu and also a general, and also known for his trust, loyalty, and honesty, doesn't have a ton to make him unique compared to the other 10 or so fighters. The novel doesn't even do much with him, exaggerating his death rather than his personality. Moving on! Zhou Yu was also known as the Beautiful Warrior by many, but don't get him mad, because he was also kind of a young genius. He was relied upon by Sun Xuan to come in with the troops and get things done. The game states he was able to bet Zhao Zhao's navy, which actually happened in real history too. Again from Wu, he proved that you can be a master warrior and look like a handsome badass too. Phew! Last one. Diao Chan is the only female on the fighting roster, and sadly, she's barely even based on real history, only appearing in the novel. I guess that's why the game designates her as being in the other category in the character bio select screen. She was able to sneakily convince Lu Bu, who will show up later in the Dynasty Warriors franchise, to kill the warlord Dong Shua, which we'll also see in the near future.
Okay, so that's all the fighters in the game. Overall, an alright cast of characters. You know, they tried to get a lot from real history, but I feel like there should have been more female representation too. You know, it's just the way Koei decided to make the game. Let's move on and discuss the world they've crafted for PlayStation.
Like in many other fighting games, the single-player mode sees you take down a new fighter at a new locale until you reach the final challenge one by one. The campaign takes you through multiple stages based on battles that took place during the time period. I started out by picking a multitude of characters, but eventually I settled on Xu Ju for the remainder of the game. Simply put, he was the only character that I could get used to and make decent progress with. I still got killed more times than I'd like to admit.
All the characters battle with a weapon of sorts. Xu Ju wields the Mighty Thorns, as the game calls them. It's basically just a giant mace, But dang, I mean, look at this thing. If you get hit with one of those suckers, that's gonna leave a mark.
Just how accurate is the nature of the one-on-one battles in this game? Well, surprisingly more than you'd think. There are a couple of recorded instances where the ancient Chinese, especially general to general, would engage in this type of behavior. In Romance of the Three Kingdoms, they were much more common and signified a bigger battle to come.
So after fighting through 8 stages, the final stage sees you face to face with Lu Bu. All we can hope to do now is button mash and pray.
Round 1, fight!
Get him, Lu Bu. Oh, come on! Oh, God!
Fight!
Come on. Screw you, Lu Bu. Screw you, Lu Bu. I did it! I did it! I beat Lu Bu! In your face! Ugh!
After beating the game, you get a cutscene based on what character you use to defeat the final boss. Shu Ju's cutscene comedically sees him trying to get some apples. You'd think the cutscene might have something to do with, actual history, but as a reward for beating Lu Bu, I don't know, it's comedic and harmless. After the cinematic, you get a summary screen of your best times. I managed to take everyone down in under a half an hour. Pretty good.
Before we move on, let's take a quick look at the other modes you can fool around with.
In Endurance mode, you pick one character and try to rack up as many wins as possible without dying. I was able to get 3. Not too impressive. Try and beat my score. Time Trial seems to be just what it says, a timed mode where you try to beat the single player mode as fast as possible. Even though the single player already keeps track of that. Hey, it's the 90s. Space was limited on a CD, and you always had to find ways to add to the replay value. There's a versus, team battle, and tournament mode that you can play with a buddy, but alas, I've only got one controller. Finally, there's the Options mode, pretty self-explanatory. This is where you can access the character information, change some fight settings, remap the controls, and save your game. Here's how the game looks on your PlayStation memory card if you're curious. I know I was.
So that's the first Dynasty Warriors. A pretty average fighting game, to be honest. But the developers in Koei really tried to develop a living, breathing world for these historical figures to fight in. If the average player decided to play this game, they might look at it and say, that's interesting. Maybe I can research some Chinese history or something like that. It permeates every inch of the experience. And, I think I can really appreciate Koei for doing something like that. Now, I say it's time to switch gears again and fast forward into the new millennium as we see just how accurate some of these games can get.
By the year 2000, gaming had become mainstream, thanks in part to the success of the PlayStation. More and more people were playing games. At the tail end of 1999, Sega, running out of money from failure after failure, released the Dreamcast, their last-ditch attempt in the console market. Of course, the next year, Sony released the PlayStation 2, the highest-selling console of all time. It was sleek, had the ability to play the futuristic DVD format, and it completely blew Sega out of the water. Nintendo followed suit with the GameCube, bringing their A-game with some of the best games ever made. It seems like the three would coexist, until a new challenger approached.
For the first time, let me now unveil Xbox.
That's right, Microsoft was entering the console market with an absolute beast of a machine. Announced in March 2000, the Xbox was by far the most powerful console up to that point. The games looked incredible, and if a game was released for all three consoles, more often than not the Xbox version looked the best. A welcome addition to the market, but not for Sega. A year later, the Dreamcast would be officially discontinued, before the Xbox even had a chance to come out. For a brief period, all the consoles coexisted. At the 2001 Electronic Entertainment Expo, all four systems greeted attendees at the entrance, something we haven't seen in 20 years. Soon after, the last big Dreamcast game came out in North America, signifying the end of an era. An empire had come and gone.
Unfortunately, we don't have much time to mourn here, so let's take a look at Jade Empire, a showcase of technical prowess for the original Xbox, released in 2005.
Jade Empire is a game developed by BioWare, a Canadian company. Before this game, they were known for their highly successful game based on Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic. After their financial success, they wanted to create a game based on traditional China and martial arts. Jade Empire was their most ambitious title yet. I mean, just look at all the people who made this game. It's insane.
Believe it or not, we actually know a lot about this game's development. What I'm holding up here is the limited edition version of Jade Empire. And if you open it up, you see you got your manual right here. You got your game right here, but what's this? Well, what this is here is a limited edition disc, only exclusive to this version. This disc contains a bonus documentary chronicling the developer's entire journey of making this game. It was made by G4, which was a television station that actually covered gaming. It was defunct for many years, but it actually just got rebooted just a couple months ago. What a coincidence!
This documentary is rather cheesy and really tries to appeal to the gamer in us all, but that's what makes it so good.
When BioWare takes one part Kung Fu.
Once you put on your Kung Fu goggles, it gets crazy. We have everything from magical or impossible fighting styles all the way to the gambit of things that are more realistic.
Mixes it with one part video game.
Do you know anybody who doesn't like people kicking ass and flying through the air? Now you put it into a game and you got something.
I'd say it's as good a time as any to start our look. I'll be playing Jade Empire today on the Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 can play a decent amount of original Xbox games, not as much as the PlayStation 3 can, but with the right cables, the games look awesome on the 360. Now, let's begin our look discussing the origin of the name Jade Emperor.
In Chinese mythology, there exists an absorbent amount of stories about a divine and godlike Jade Emperor. Some say he crafted humans out of clay. Some say he wasn't responsible for creation at all, serving barely as an advisor. Some say he decided the 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac by hosting a race between all the animals of the world.
If one thing's for certain, the title of Jade Empire communicates perfectly to the player that not everything they're going to see in this game is true, and that's actually a melding of lots of different myths and legends.
The game begins with an extensive cutscene. Already we can see just how the game is based on myth rather than history. Is that flying machines? And magic? Oh god. After starting, we are tasked with picking and naming our characters. The game gives you a lot of options. There's even female representation accounted for too. I decided to pick Lou the Prodigy, which the game says is balanced. I quickly renamed him R.J. the Prodigy just to spice things up. The character stats are divided into 3 sections: mind, body, and spirit. Fitting.
Fair warning if you want to explore this game yourself, It's very, very long, about 18 hours. For this video, we'll just be covering the first chapter of the game, which is 3 hours. Ugh.
We open up on what appears to be a martial arts training village named Two Rivers, with R.J. the Prodigy talking to a friend, Jing Wu. This game has an incredible amount of voice acting, which the developers were clearly proud of.
We have 352 characters that speak in the game. So to get those 352 characters, we're using 80 different actors, over half of them being in Los Angeles, the rest of them being here in Edmonton. So simultaneously, we're running 2 studios over a period of 12 weeks, and it's just been a fantastically huge process.
You can respond to most of this dialogue with a selection of choices, one being a moral choice, one being a neutral route, and the other being kind of an asshole response to everything. I tried to change my choices while I played. Supposedly these choices eventually change the ending of the game, but we just don't have time for that.
Lots of games from around this time did the good and evil mechanic. The most popular being a game called Fable, released around the same time for the Xbox, also an exclusive as well. You know, it works well in this game based on the sheer nature of the yin and the yang, a balance and symbol of light and darkness. Which will you lean towards? Well, the choice is up to us.
As with previous BioWare releases, morality will play a key role in the game.
We really struggled to put a lot of extra choice in this game. It's not just black and white, it changes the way the general game develops.
Are these floating stones not wondrous?
The choice is really important. There's multiple endings.
That is a dark philosophy, but I would not dare to argue with you.
Good and evil, but with more of a gray zone in between.
The game then shows you the tutorial on how to fight. It's a pretty in-depth system, obviously based on a combination of many Asian fighting styles. In fact, your styles, or moves, are tied to the D-pad, letting you select different ways of beating your foe. In Mythstory, martial arts can be traced back to the Xia Dynasty, where Huang Di supposedly introduced it. In the Spring and Autumn Annals, some of the oldest surviving writing on Chinese history, it mentions a fighting style that has hard and soft blows, similar to default attacks and special moves in the game.
There's also the option to turn into giant creatures in the game, another option of fighting.
I inherited the ability to turn into a toad deal. It's literally a massive toad, and it's just as weird and as cool as you think it is.
The developers had a unique way of developing this combat, and you know, I think it's best for them to speak for themselves.
It's very stylized, very nuanced, very kinetic. To that, we look to the experts in Hong Kong cinema.
We first, of course, watched as many kung fu movies as we could.
We also watched, every movie we could find, and we ran the spectrum from like the cheesiest, stupidest, most ridiculous martial arts movie from the 60s or 70s, all the way to really, really good Asian films like Hero or Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Once someone starts watching all these and you put on your kung fu goggles, and once the kung fu goggles are on, it gets crazy. You come up with some amazing ideas that actually transfer really well into video games.
But the developers also took inspiration from what they called the primary source.
When we started work on Jade Empire, one of the first things we did was start with the primary source. In many cases, the kung fu movies we see are all references back to that. So we went back to the original source, things like Journey to the West, Outlaws of the March, these really, really old Chinese novels, hundreds of years old in many cases.
For my part, I delved more deeply into myths and arts of ancient China.
If all of those myths were true, then Jade Empire is the world that would have resulted from that.
Indeed, there's tons of things in this game based on countless myths. As we delve deeper in the game, I'll be sure to point some out.
The story of this first chapter is pretty complex, so here's what you need to know without being bored to death. Your character was an orphan and grew up in Two Rivers, being trained in martial arts by Master Li. How original. These pupils are called spirit monks. Another monk, named Gao the Lesser, is jealous of your combat superiority and acts as an early protagonist. Master Li shuns Gao after an unbalanced duel between him and us, and promptly banishes him from Two Rivers. Gao, enraged, kidnaps your friend Dawnstar and begins attacking the nearby area with the help of his father, Gao the Greater, and his followers, the Lotus Assassins. On your way to rescue her, you run into another character, Sagacious Zhu, in the marsh that helps you take down Gao and rescue Dawnstar in a nearby cave. three of you unite and follow Gao the Lesser, only to find that Two Rivers has been completely burned to the ground, with no sign of Master Li.
And that's only a basic summary. There's a lot of dialogue and fighting in between that. Jade Empire is definitely a game you need to get invested in to truly understand.
The visuals are simply stunning for the time, and it really immerses you into the mythical world BioWare created. Just in the first couple of hours, we are taken to a school in the mountains, grasslands, a marsh, multiple villages and caves, and even the skies.
Yeah, let's discuss the skies, shall we?
After stopping Gao, the trio takes a flying contraption back to Two Rivers. It resembles a bug with wings, with a rocket thrown in the back. The game then completely switches genres and turns into a space shooter minigame over the burning town. A pretty ingenious way of breaking up the monotonous dialogue and fighting, but not at all accurate to real history. Or maybe it is in part? The ancient Chinese did invent the kite sometime in the 4th century BCE after all, perhaps even earlier. These kites resemble all sorts of creatures, both real and mythological, including the insect-like machine in the game. Later down the line, man-carrying kites were used in Chinese military operations too.
Before the banishing of Gao by Master Li, he actually tasks you with going into a spirit cave to banish the evil spirits within and to show the moral corruption of the spirit realm.
In the cave you find the Dragon Amulet, which allows you to use elemental attacks. A spirit gives you the choice of selecting fire or ice as your first skill. Again, a choice tying to the yin-yang. I chose ice because, good lord, I think there's enough fire in this game already.
In conclusion, Jade Empire is one of the most ambitious and expansive games I've ever taken a look at. The developers really tried to show a little slice of history, and they really cared about what they wanted to create.
The inclusion of many myths and legends makes this the perfect game to delve into if you're interested in any myth surrounding China. And I don't think there's been a game released since then that has just so much of it.
For our final games today, we're going back to Dynasty Warriors to explore some newer games in the saga.
After the monumental success of the PlayStation 2, Sony got arrogant by 2006. Their next console, the PlayStation 3, had a disastrous launch. It was overpriced, launching for $599 US. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $800 today. The system was so chock full of technology. Every system came with 4 USB ports, HD output, a Blu-ray drive, and was backwards compatible with the PS2 on a hardware level, including 2 CPUs and GPUs, one for the old titles and one for the new. Most players didn't even have HD displays 15 years ago, and even more of them didn't have the money to spare, not to mention, the consoles looked like George Foreman grills. Sony specifically made the system difficult to develop games for. They argued that developers would be so busy learning to make games for it, they wouldn't have time to make games for the Xbox 360. Quite the opposite happened. Many developers abandoned ship, and games ran and looked better on the competing system.
Now, Koei had started releasing Dynasty Warriors on both systems with the third game. The genre had been completely changed. Now it's a 3D hack and slash where you control a character running around in a large open space with hordes of enemies coming at you. Today we'll be looking at Dynasty Warriors 7, released in 2011 for the PlayStation 3.
This generation of consoles was the first to have mainstream internet functions. Back then, when a game shipped, it had to be complete. But not anymore. We live in the age of updates and downloadable content. Amazingly, the PlayStation 3, a 15-year-old system, still has most online services supported. But soon, hundreds of games will have no way of updating, and some games and updates will be lost to history.
So let's stick this in and hope we can still update it.
Okay, now after all that hassle, let's maybe play the game? Let's see here. Looks like Koei is still making these games, now under the name Koei Tecmo, as one of 2 companies merged in 2009. The opening cutscene is extreme! Babies crying, epic horses, rock music, ninjas running on walls, sliding down and fighting on waterfalls?
But we've certainly come a long way in 15 years, don't you think? I feel like I'm about to explode from the excitement!
Starting off, you can pick a variety of options. You can play a tutorial, which you'll most likely need to understand the complex controls. Story mode is our main focus today. You can play a branching story starting in any of the 3 kingdoms. Conquest mode lets you write your own story with any character you like, but that kind of defeats the purpose of it being based on real history. The Encyclopedia is a massive historical collection of information about the real 3 kingdoms. I'm honestly impressed. It's like an interactive textbook, explaining most, if not all, of the details fairly well. You could spend hours reading it all. The options mode, like the first game, speaks for itself, but interestingly enough, you can turn on a 3D mode.
That's right. This game can be displayed in 3D for some reason. All you need is a proprietary PlayStation 3D display, some 3D glasses, and another $500! Needless to say, I won't be playing in 3D today.
Beginning story mode gives us the options of Shu, Wu, Wei, and Jin to sink our teeth into. I'll be playing the first mission or 2 of each kingdom and reporting my findings. I won't be covering the Jin Dynasty, as you need to finish the other 3 entirely to play it. It makes sense, though. Jin forks at the end of the 3 kingdoms, with China unified once more.
I'm just going to warn you straight up, the gameplay here barely resembles the first game. Are you ready? Here it comes.
The first cutscene in Wei's story shows Cao Cao looking rather different than he did in the first game, mind you, and his various commanders. After a couple of horse antics, here we are in our first battle. This part of the game is during the Yellow Turban Rebellion, one of the first events to topple the Eastern Han Dynasty. This is what we'll be focusing on. Progression is simple. Kill anyone and anything that stands in your way. Defeat certain commanders, and defeat the boss at the end of each level. As you can imagine, killing the same enemies over and over, even with a kill counter, gets tiring real quick.
Geez, all I'm really doing is mashing the attack button over and over again. There's not really a whole lot of depth here. Sometimes there's obstacles, like there's a boulder, and there's, some steps, but, there's not really much to do. I'm just kind of killing people.
Excellent. Our teamwork was flawless.
In the rare chance that you get low on health, you can find some, they look like steamed buns or mantu just lying around in pots and crates. These mantu have fascinating origins, dating back to the 3rd century, fabled to be created by military strategist Zheng Yao. Maybe there is a connection to buns in battle. All this food talk is making me hungry.
Hi, I'd like to order some dumplings, please. Yeah, delivery. Alright, how long? How long if I come pick it up? Nah, delivery's fine. Alright, thanks.
At the end of the first level, the sorcerer known as Jiang Tijao is defeated after a boss battle. He shoots fire and you need to destroy cauldrons to weaken him. In real history, he was the leader of the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Only did the novel give him magical powers. Cauldrons show up a lot in Chinese myth, symbolizing power. As for the other 2 kingdoms, they also have to take him down for some reason too. I guess it acts as a tutorial level for all 3 stories, but I played the same thing 3 times in a row for Pete's sake.
From there, the story splits, but quickly reconvenes again. I'll give a brief summary.
The Wei story sees Cao Cao meeting with Dong Zhuo, the leader of the Han government. He sets up a trap for them at Lu Ouyang Castle. Here we meet Lu Bu, remember him? At the time, he was one of Dong Zhuo's leading officers. He makes a rather dominant entry in the games when you first meet him, but I find it kind of funny with the voice acting.
I am Lu Bu.
I am Lu Bu.
Lu Bu is a force to be reckoned with, and the game advises you to flee from him, as he is too strong to fight at the moment. Eventually, you escape the castle, and the storylines converge in Shu's story. Here, all 3 of the major warlords, Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan, work together to drive out Dong Zhuo from the capital.
And that's where I stopped playing. The gameplay was so boring despite being portrayed as such a badass experience. Its depictions of history in the novel are probably better than the first Dynasty Warriors, but the parts that are romanticized are even worse now, and that's likely something that's just going to get worse as the games go on.
I get that it's based on the novel, but it's a skewed view of what really happened. This series of games is the most accessible taste of the Three Kingdoms a player is going to get these days. This might be a person's only experience of the subject they'll ever get. Heck, I walked into a local used game store recently and found the sequel to this game, Dynasty Warriors 8, at a price of only $13. Someone is going to look at that and say, wow, what a steal! Play it, and get a skewed view of history unless you read the encyclopedia. But let's face it, no gamer wants to read.
Accessibility is a huge thing for gamers today. Most people don't want to go and play large, complex games with huge storylines and big villains. Sometimes portable experiences can be just as effective, and luckily for us, Koei thought of this too.
Dynasty Warriors Advanced graced Nintendo's Game Boy Advance the same year as Jade Empire came out, and aims to put the Three Kingdoms in a portable setting. Like Dynasty Warriors 7, it's a hack-and-slash game with 3 selectable campaigns, but for obvious reasons, this formula is watered down on the Game Boy. You fight no more than 25 enemies at a time, and it's still the same button-mashing gameplay. The game switches between sections where you fight multiple enemies, and a map-oriented view where you carefully select where your troops go. This is similar to Nintendo's own Fire Emblem franchise on the same system. It's a strategy role-playing game.
But guess what? Even though this game is inferior to the PlayStation 3 version in almost every way, Shuju is back!
Oh, how I've missed you, buddy! Even though your design is completely different than the original game. Keep calm and carry on, my friend.
We've looked at a plethora of games today. All in all, I think they all have their strengths and weaknesses in their depictions.
Super Mario Land and Pokemon aren't even meant to be based on Chinese history, but by sheer coincidence, there's a lot of things worth looking at in them. I think it's great that younger players are exposed to Chinese history like this, even if it's not entirely true. It gets the cogwheels turning. The Dynasty Warriors games are basic by design, but have a lot of lore in them. Koei took the time to make great games with lots of elements. Although they were all based on Romance of the Three Kingdoms, I think the novel is important in our understanding of Chinese history in its own right. The novel helped to fill in pieces we didn't know a ton about, and who knows, we might even find more about the Three Kingdoms someday. New things are always being discovered or dug up. They just need to work on toning down the coolness for future installments. Jade Empire was masterful in its world of Chinese myths and legends. BioWare didn't aim for something historically accurate, and that's okay. In Chinese history, sometimes those myths are just as important as real history. We know that the Xia existed based on legends in the first place.
If you want to become a historian of China on your own through gaming, the best place to start would probably be your phone. There's just so many different games based on Chinese history. I think there's one called, Total War Three Kingdoms? There might be even Dynasty Warriors games on your phone. But if you dare decide to take the journey, voice your opinion. Tell these developers to be accurate in their depiction of the most populated and historically rich country in the world. The dumplings are here! Gotta go! Oh, man.